what the Buddha really meant by non-self, Anatta. There is a quiet ache that runs beneath much of modern life. It does not always announce itself loudly. Often, it hums softly, like an electrical current behind the walls of our days. It is felt in the way we grasp for certainty in relationships, in the way we defend opinions as if they were flesh, in the way a single insult can echo in the mind for years while 100 kindnesses fade unnoticed. This ache comes from a simple, deeply human habit, the sense that there is a solid me inside all of this, a center that must be protected, improved, justified, and remembered. We wake up each morning already carrying this me on our backs, like a pack we have never set down long enough to examine. The Buddha's teaching on non-self, Anatta, does not arrive as a philosophical puzzle meant to impress the intellect. It arrives more like a hand, gently touching the shoulder in the dark. It points not toward an abstract idea, but toward the lived texture of experience itself. When misunderstood, non-self sounds cold, even frightening, as if it were denying our humanity or erasing what makes us unique. Many people recoil from it, imagining a bleak emptiness where nothing matters and no one exists. Yet this fear arises from listening with the mind alone rather than with the body, the breath, and the heart. In truth, the teaching of non-self is intimate. It is not about becoming nothing. It is about no longer being trapped in something that was never as solid as we believed. It speaks directly to suffering, not as a concept, but as a felt weight in the chest, a tightening in the jaw, a story replayed again and again in the mind. When the Buddha spoke of Anatta, he was not stripping life of meaning. He was loosening the knot that makes life feel unbearable. Tonight, imagine we are sitting together near a small fire in the forest. The air is cool. The sounds of insects rise and fall like a living breath. There is nothing to prove here, nothing to defend, just an invitation to look closely at what we call self, not to destroy it, but to understand it so deeply that its grip begins to soften on its own. This is not a teaching to be believed. It is a truth to be seen, quietly, patiently, from the inside. The word self feels obvious. It seems to require no explanation. We say, I am tired, I am angry, I am afraid, and the language itself reinforces the sense that there is an owner behind these experiences, a fixed point from which thoughts, emotions, and actions emerge. From childhood, this sense of self is carefully assembled. A name is given, a body is pointed out in the mirror. Preferences are encouraged, success is praised, failure is corrected. Slowly, a story takes shape, and we learn to call that story me. Yet if we slow down and look carefully, this me is strangely elusive. When you search for it in direct experience, where does it reside? Is it in the body? The body is constantly changing. Cells die and are replaced. Sensations rise and pass like weather. Pain appears, stays for a while, and dissolves. Pleasure does the same. If the self were the body, it would have to change every moment with it. But we tend to think of the self as something more stable than that. Perhaps the self is in the mind. Thoughts certainly feel personal. Some are comforting, others cruel. Some feel chosen, others intrusive. But if you watch closely, thoughts arise on their own. You do not decide the next thought before it appears. It simply comes, uninvited, shaped by memory, mood, and countless conditions beyond conscious control. A memory from 10 years ago surfaces. A fragment of a song repeats itself. An image flashes and vanishes. If the self were the thinker of thoughts, it should be able to choose only pleasant ones and silence the rest. Yet the mind does not obey in this way. Maybe the self is found in emotions. I am angry feels deeply convincing when anger burns in the chest. But anger is not constant. It flares, peaks, and fades. When it fades, where does the self go? Does it disappear with the emotion, only to return when joy arises? Or perhaps the self is the observer, the one who knows all of this. This seems closer. There is awareness of body, mind, and emotion. But even this awareness shifts. Sometimes it is clear and spacious. Sometimes it is dull, contracted, or lost entirely in distraction or sleep. The Buddha's insight was not that nothing exists, but that nothing exists in the way we assume. What we call self is not a single solid entity. It is a process, a flowing pattern of conditions arising and ceasing moment by moment. Like a river, it has a recognizable shape, yet no fixed substance. You can point to the river, name it, depend on it, but you cannot step into the same water twice. Still, we do not say the river is unreal. We simply understand its nature. The suffering begins when we mistake the pattern for a permanent owner. We cling to this imagined owner as if it were the core of our safety. When praised, the self swells. When criticized, it contracts. When ignored, it aches. Entire lives are organized around protecting this sense of me from threat and feeding it with approval. Social media amplifies this tendency, turning identity into a performance and worth into a number. The self becomes a project that is never finished, always slightly inadequate, always needing more proof. Non-self points to the exhaustion hidden in this project. It asks a radical but gentle question. What if the struggle to constantly define and defend me is the very source of our pain? What if peace is not found by perfecting the self, but by seeing through the assumption that there is a solid self to perfect it all? This is not an idea to adopt, but a perspective that emerges naturally when attention becomes steady and honest. Consider a moment of deep absorption, perhaps while listening to music, walking alone in nature, or caring for someone you love. In those moments, the sense of self often fades into the background. There is just sound, movement, warmth, presence. No commentator is needed. And strangely, these are often the moments we later describe as most alive, most meaningful. The self did not disappear because something was wrong. It softened because nothing was lacking. The teaching of Anatta does not ask us to destroy the personality or deny the practical reality of identity. You still have a name. You still respond when called. You still remember your commitments and care for your body. What changes is the belief that behind all of this, there must be an unchanging essence that defines who you truly are. When this belief loosens, life becomes lighter, not empty. This is why non-self is inseparable from compassion. When the self is seen as a process rather than a possession, the sharp boundary between me and you begins to blur. Another person's anger no longer feels like a personal attack from a solid enemy. It is seen as a wave passing through conditions, much like your own anger. Another person's joy no longer provokes comparison in the same way. It is simply joy, arising where conditions allow. From this understanding, kindness flows more easily, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural response to shared fragility. In daily life, the insight into non-self shows itself in small moments. A harsh word is spoken, and instead of instantly defending, there is a pause. Sensation is felt. The urge to react is noticed. It passes. A mistake is made, and instead of collapsing into shame, there is an acknowledgement of causes and conditions. Learning happens without self-contempt. Success arrives, and instead of clinging to it as proof of worth, there is gratitude, humility, and awareness of impermanence. To see non-self is not to become passive or indifferent. It is to act without the extra burden of ego. Actions still have consequences. Choices still matter. But they are no longer constantly filtered through the question, what does this say about me? This freedom is subtle, but profound. It is the difference between carrying a heavy pack everywhere and walking with open hands. As we continue, the exploration will deepen. We will look more closely at how the illusion of self is constructed moment by moment, and how its unraveling does not lead to collapse, but to an unexpected intimacy with life itself. For now, let this be enough. The sense of self you have been protecting so fiercely may not be the source of your dignity or your meaning. It may simply be a habit of perception, one that can be gently unlearned, revealing a freedom that was never truly absent, only obscured. When the Buddha spoke of non-self, he was not offering a theory about what humans are made of. He was pointing to a way of seeing that cuts directly into the mechanics of suffering. To understand this, we must look closely at how the sense of self is continuously rebuilt, moment by moment, often without our awareness. The self is not a single illusion that appeared once in childhood and stayed intact ever since. It is an activity. It is something we do. Each time a sensation arises, the mind quietly asks, is this for me or against me? Each time a thought appears, it is measured. Does this support the story of who I am or threaten it? Each emotion is quickly claimed. My fear, my pride, my sadness, my hope. This claiming happens so quickly that it feels automatic, even necessary. Yet it is precisely here, in this reflexive grasping, that the knot tightens. Notice how experience unfolds when something unpleasant happens. A sharp word is spoken. Before the sound has fully faded, the body reacts. There is heat in the face, tension in the chest, a contraction in the stomach. Then the mind moves in, weaving a narrative. They disrespected me. They always do this. I don't deserve this. In a matter of seconds, a simple vibration in the air has become a solid drama, complete with a wounded self at its center. The suffering does not come from the sound itself. It comes from the identification. Non-self does not deny the pain of the moment. It does not ask you to pretend that the words did not hurt. Instead, it invites a more intimate attention. When the attention stays close to raw experience, something remarkable becomes clear. Sensation is just sensation. Tightness is just tightness. Thoughts are just thoughts. None of them announce on their own, this is happening to a permanent me. That message is added later, stitched together by habit. The same is true for pleasant experiences. Praise is received. Pleasure arises. The body relaxes. The mind smiles inwardly and says, this proves something about me. I am valued. I am successful. I am safe. Immediately, the pleasant feeling is burdened with the task of supporting an identity, and because no feeling can last, anxiety quietly enters. What happens when this fades? What must I do to keep it? The seed of suffering is planted even in joy. The Buddha's insight was that identification is the hidden engine behind this cycle. We do not suffer because experiences arise and pass. We suffer because we take them personally. We wrap them around an imagined center and call that center self. Anatta points not to the absence of experience, but to the absence of an owner within experience. This can be deeply unsettling at first. The mind asks, if there is no self, who is responsible? Who chooses? Who loves? Who awakens? These questions arise from the fear that without a solid self, life will become chaotic or meaningless. But this fear itself is another movement of selfing, another attempt to secure ground. Look closely at responsibility. Even without a fixed self, actions still occur. Intentions still arise. Choices are still made. causes still lead to effects. If anything, responsibility becomes clearer, not weaker, because it is no longer obscured by denial or self-deception. When there is no need to protect an image of me, it becomes easier to admit harm, to apologize, to change. Accountability does not require a permanent essence. It requires awareness. Love, too, is not diminished by non-self. In fact, it is often distorted by an exaggerated sense of self. When love is filtered through identity, it becomes tangled with possession, fear, and expectation. You should make me feel valued. You should not leave. You should confirm who I am. Seen through the lens of non-self, love is freed from some of this weight. It becomes an expression of connection, rather than a transaction between egos. Care flows more naturally when it is not constantly asking, "What am I getting from this?" The Buddha did not describe awakening as the annihilation of a person, but as the ending of ignorance. Ignorance here does not mean lack of intelligence. It means not seeing clearly how experience actually works. The ignorance is the assumption that there must be a solid entity at the center of the flow, directing and owning it all. When this assumption dissolves, what remains is not a void, but a vivid, intimate engagement with life as it unfolds. This is why the teaching of non-self cannot be fully grasped through thinking alone. Concepts can point, but they cannot replace seeing. You may intellectually agree that the self is constructed, and yet still feel deeply wounded by a small slight. This does not mean you have failed. It means the habit is ancient and embodied. Insight deepens through patient observation, not force. In meditation, this observation becomes especially clear. You sit still, the body breathes, sensations arise, thoughts appear and disappear like clouds. At first it feels as though you are watching all of this. But with time, even the watcher is revealed to be another experience, another subtle thought or stance that arises and passes. There is awareness, but it does not belong to anyone. It is present. In daily life, this understanding matures slowly. You begin to notice the moment when identification happens. There is a fraction of a second where experience is just experience, before it becomes mine. In that small space, there is freedom, not the dramatic freedom of escaping the world, but the quiet freedom of not adding unnecessary suffering to what is already here. Imagine carrying a fragile glass everywhere, believing it contains yourself. Every bump feels dangerous, every fall catastrophic. Non-self is the realization that there is no glass to protect. There is care, yes, there is sensitivity, but the constant fear of shattering relaxes. Life is still fragile, but not in the way you thought. As this insight deepens, something else becomes apparent. Much of what we call self is inherited. Beliefs, fears, preferences, and reactions are passed down through family, culture, and biology. You did not choose your language, your early conditioning, your genetic tendency. Seeing this clearly softens self-judgment and judgment of others. How can there be hatred when it is seen that everyone is acting from conditions they did not fully choose? This does not excuse harmful behavior. It contextualizes it. It allows wisdom and compassion to arise together. Instead of asking, "How do I punish this self?" the question becomes, what conditions led to this, and how can they be changed? This shift is one of the quiet revolutions of the Buddha's teaching. Non-self is not an escape from the world. It is an invitation to meet the world without armor. When the armor of identity loosens, vulnerability is no longer a threat. It is simply part of being alive. Pain is still painful. Loss still hurts. But the added suffering of "why is this happening to me?" begins to fade. There is grief, but less bitterness. There is effort, but less strain. As we move forward, The question becomes not do I exist, but how am I existing right now? Am I existing as a clenched fist around an idea of myself, or as an open hand responding to conditions with care and clarity? The teaching of non-self gently inclines us toward the open hand, not through command, but through understanding. In the next movement of this reflection, we will look at how non-self and freedom are intimately linked, and how the letting go of a fixed identity reveals a depth of peace that does not depend on circumstances. For now, let the insight settle quietly, like ash drifting down after a fire, softening the ground without needing to announce itself. As the understanding of non-self matures, something subtle but profound begins to change in the way freedom is experienced. At first, freedom is often imagined as control over circumstances, over emotions, over outcomes. We want to feel free by arranging the world so that it no longer threatens the self we believe we are. But this kind of freedom is fragile. It depends on endless effort, constant vigilance, and conditions that never stay put. The Buddha's insight points to a different freedom altogether, one that does not rely on rearranging life, but on seeing through the mistaken assumptions that make life feel constricting. When the sense of a solid self loosens, experience becomes less personal, without becoming less intimate. This may sound paradoxical, but it is something many people taste briefly without recognizing it. There are moments when you are deeply present, perhaps watching rain fall, listening to a child laugh, or sitting quietly at the end of a long day. In those moments, there is no commentary about who you are or what this means for your future. There is simply seeing, hearing. Strangely, these moments often feel more real than the hours spent lost in thought. Non-self is not the absence of experience. It is the absence of unnecessary distance from experience. One of the great misunderstandings about Anatta is the fear that without a self, there can be no direction or purpose. Yet when the grip of identity relaxes, a different kind of intelligence comes forward. Actions begin to arise more directly from the situation at hand, rather than from the need to defend or enhance an image. When someone is suffering, compassion responds naturally, without calculation. When rest is needed, the body rests without guilt. When effort is required, effort appears without resentment. Life begins to feel less like a strategy and more like a conversation. This does not mean that old habits vanish overnight. Conditioning has momentum. Even with insight, the sense of self can reassert itself, especially under stress. But now it is seen more clearly. Anger arises, and it is known as anger, not as a permanent flaw or a justified identity. Fear appears, and it is felt in the body, without being immediately turned into a story about inadequacy or danger. This knowing does not suppress experience. It holds it gently, allowing it to move and change. And this way, non-self becomes deeply practical. It changes how you listen. When someone speaks, you are less busy preparing your response or defending your position. You hear more fully. It changes how you disagree. There is firmness without hostility, clarity without contempt. It changes how you fail. Failure no longer defines who you are. It becomes information, painful perhaps, but workable. It changes how you age. The body changes, abilities shift, roles fall away, and yet there is less panic because identity was never truly anchored in these forms. Perhaps the most radical aspect of non-self is how it transforms our relationship with suffering itself. Pain still arises, loss still comes, the world remains uncertain, but the question, why me, loses some of its force. Not because life becomes fair, but because the assumption behind the question weakens. Suffering is no longer interpreted as a personal indictment. It is seen as part of the shared condition of being alive, something that connects rather than isolates. From this perspective, compassion is no longer a virtue to cultivate through effort alone. It is the natural expression of seeing clearly. When the boundary between self and other is understood as fluid and conditioned, care arises spontaneously. Harming another feels less conceivable, not because of moral rules, but because the separation that would justify harm is seen through. Helping another feels less heroic and more ordinary, simply the appropriate response to what is happening. This is why the Buddha's teaching on non-self is inseparable from liberation. Liberation is not an escape from the human experience, but a release from the compulsive need to make that experience revolve around a fictional center. When the center dissolves, what remains is not confusion, but a surprising steadiness. The mind becomes more like a clear sky through which weather passes, rather than a small room battered by every storm. Even death is seen differently through this lens. The fear of death is often rooted in the fear of annihilating a self that we imagine to be solid and continuous. When the self is understood as a process rather than a thing, death is no longer the destruction of an entity, but the ending of a particular pattern of conditions. This does not eliminate grief or the instinct to live, but it softens the existential terror that comes from clinging to an image of permanence where none was ever found. Living with the understanding of non-self does not make one distant or aloof. On the contrary, it often brings a tenderness that surprises those who expect detachment. When there is less need to protect an identity, the heart has more room to open. Tears come more easily, and so does laughter. Gratitude deepens, not because life is perfect, but because it is seen as fleeting and precious, arising moment by moment without guarantee. This understanding also brings humility. Without a solid self to defend, there is less need to be right at all costs. Learning becomes easier, changing becomes less threatening. The recognition that everything arises from conditions fosters a quiet respect for the complexity of life. One stops standing at the center of the universe and begins to stand within it. As this perspective settles, practice itself becomes lighter. Meditation is no longer a project to improve the self. It is a space to observe how selfing happens and how it relaxes. Ethical living is no longer about polishing an image of goodness. It is about reducing harm, because harm is seen more clearly. Wisdom is no longer something owned. It is something expressed through the way life is met. Non-self, then, is not a destination. It is a way of seeing that continually deepens. Some days it feels clear and liberating. Other days it feels distant, obscured by habit and emotion. Both are part of the path. There is no final self that attains non-self. There is only the gradual fading of confusion and the increasing ease of being with what is. The Buddha's teaching on non-self was never meant to strip life of meaning. It was meant to return meaning to where it belongs, to direct experience, free from the heavy overlay of fear and grasp. When the illusion of a fixed self begins to soften, what remains is not emptiness in the cold sense, but openness. An openness that allows joy without clinging, sorrow without despair, and love without possession. To walk with this understanding is to move through the world a little more lightly. You still feel the ground beneath your feet. You still respond to the needs of the moment. But you do so without constantly carrying the question of who you are supposed to be. In that release, there is space to simply be human, with all the vulnerability and beauty that entail. If these reflections have resonated with something quiet and familiar within you, let that be enough for now. Understanding deepens through living, through watching, through returning again and again to the immediacy of experience. If you wish to continue exploring these teachings, to sit together by this metaphorical fire, and listen more closely to the silence beneath the words, you are welcome to follow this channel, not as a commitment, but as an invitation to keep looking gently, honestly, and with compassion at the nature of this life we are sharing, moment by moment.